Great. So thank you very much for having me again. I think it's been 2 weeks since I spoke at the last one. As you already said, I'm a student at SIUC, so that's the Scottish Rural University College. I've been there since 2019 and degrees in wildlife and conservation management. I currently work at Malls Maya Community Woodland. That's a local nature reserve in Glasgow. I work for a charity there, and we've taken over the management of the site. And luckily, we've got some ponds and dragonflies there too. My history with local nature reserves goes back quite a few years as chair of the Friends of Fernbury Meadows Local Nature Reserve, and also as a member of the Friends of Home Hills Woods Community Park, where a lot of my dragonfly recording has been going on for the last couple of years. And my history of dragonflies really started in 2019 with the People for Prawns project. So we had Andrea come to Ridley's Urban Park, and she delivered our basic dragonfly training for us. And that kind of really set my trajectory in this way. I hadn't been at university at this point, but I got so hooked on dragonflies, and I spent the whole summer at the ponds that eventually at the end of August, I signed up to go back to uni. I spent the last couple of years surveying dragonflies, looking at stream pollution, larval IDs, all sorts of different things that kind of eventually led me now to doing this dissertation, looking at pollution and dragonflies. So this is just like, I think it's just really nice to look back at the People for Ponds project. It was a beautiful day in July, and yeah, as I say, it really kind of changed how I was working and where I'm working and what I'm studying. So to look at the project now, there's a lot of different potential impacts that dogs can have on ponds. That starts with maybe trampling of vegetation, which can lead to a loss of habitat. That can also lead to quite a lot of siltation in the water, which can have a knock-on effect because it could potentially reduce primary production, because nothing can grow because no light kind of reaches a lot of areas of the pond if it's constantly siltated. There could also be a direct impact on animals living in the ponds. I've seen that sometimes with frogs, but even tadpoles and dragonflies, where they get disturbed from what they were originally going to do in the pond. And a lot of times, even with tadpoles, especially when they're quite young and not so very mobile, we've seen them kind of swept out into the dry areas just by dogs playing around the edge of ponds. Another quite interesting part of this is the veterinary flea treatments the dogs have on their backs. There is a potential pathway for these treatments to reach waters by the dogs being in the pond swimming. But there's also an issue with excess nutrients and other kind of chemicals that could come into the water through the dogs. And also sometimes the dog owners, because a lot of times dog poo doesn't get picked up, or if it does get picked up, it gets put in a bag. Sometimes it gets hung on trees. Other times we find it swimming in the water. So there's quite a few different ways that in theory dogs could have an impact on ponds. So just to summarize, it's a combination of the water quality, the structure of the vegetation, and maybe some direct disturbance of the animals. Obviously at the start of this project, so I'm not out to too many ponds yet, but I find this really interesting pond, the photos from the Freshwater Habitat Trust, where they've fenced off parts of the ponds so they wouldn't be accessible to dogs, just to show that kind of stark contrast between how the pond looks like without dogs to what the pond looks like with dog disturbance. And I think those kind of images just really speak for themselves. This one is, I call it poaching, same as with cattle, when you have all that trampling where they go and maybe to drink at a pond, but this here is all caused by dogs. I've got a local nature reserve not far from where I stay that is very popular with dogs. So there are hundreds of them out there, and you can really, really see the impact that all this trampling at the water's edge has. The surface vegetation is completely removed. All that soil is exposed to the elements. It's very prone to being washed into the water. And if you have a closer look, you can actually see how silted up that water is. So that is actually how those ponds look like on most of the sides, and probably all the ones across that side that I've seen have had that kind of state of their vegetation and soils. And this is not moving. Oh yeah, there. So as I said, yeah, there could be a link to the water quality. For me, that's a combination of the pollution but also the siltation. And then a lot of the ponds in the area have probably even other pressures on top of the ones that dogs are bringing. So we've looked at nitrate levels and wastewater runoff in some of our local nature reserves, which just can compound the issue of what the dogs are causing possibly as well. So going back a couple of years, I've done a water quality survey at two of the local nature reserves. One's from Bray Meadows and the other one's Home Hills. There's a stream leading to the wetland area, and along that stream, we've done kick sampling on 4 sites. And as we get closer and closer to the farmland, you can see this real increase in nitrates, and the variation in the species that are present along the streams changes quite dramatically. So you get the better indicator species furthest away from the pollution. But as you get closer and closer, you kind of mostly find water leeches, water hog lice, but none of these better indicator species, no dragonflies, no mayflies. So I guess that interest in pollution and how that affects dragonflies has been with me for the last couple of years as well. In contrast to what we found, this chart is from Bray Meadows. We also looked at Home Hills, which is in Cambuslang, and there was no nitrates in there because there was no runoff from anywhere. And the macroinvertebrates were a lot more abundant. We had our 9 species of dragonflies, we've had caddisflies, mayflies. You could just really see a huge difference in the variety of species in the ponds. So when I approached the Dragonfly Society if there was a project they might be interested in, and I got an email back from Steve Brooks with the idea of looking at that impact dogs have on ponds and the combination of pollution and direct impacts. I was really, really interested because it kind of already fitted with my previous interests. So if I look at this paper here, it was Rosemary Perkins. She did a PhD with Dave Gilson. You probably all heard of him. And they were looking at the veterinary flea treatments in English rivers. And what they found is that most of those chemicals that are associated with the veterinary flea treatments can be detected in the rivers with quite a clear signal from urban areas and areas just underneath wastewater treatment plants. And the hypothesis is that these chemicals come from the dogs. So they obviously have to be spot-on treatments and tablets and different ways to deal with ectoparasites. But these can wash off the dogs. So if you wash the dog in the sink, in the bathtub, then that water gets run down through the water treatment plants, but they obviously don't remove all these pesticides. The same is for the bedding of the dog, if that gets washed, because these pesticides are all systemic, which means they go into each cell of the dog and they shed through the skin, they come through the urine. So anything you wash, including the dog, can transfer these pesticides into the water. So what they have done, they looked at the rivers and obviously the pathway through the wastewater treatments from the homes, but I would be quite interested to look at if dogs can directly transfer those pesticides into ponds by visiting them and going swimming in them. So that's going to be part of what I would like to look at. In regards to the ponds that I want to look at, because there's such a clear spike in the signal of these pesticides from urban areas, I'd like to compare some urban ponds with more rural ones to see if the distance to settlements, urban areas, or even paths makes a difference into the amount of disturbance the pond gets. I'd also like to look at some of the kind of dragonfly hotspots that may be a bit closer to me. So Gardcosh, Flanders moss, maybe greenhead moss, also some of the local nature reserves around the area where I know the history of species from the last couple of years. And I've also got quite a good handle of the amount of dog use that these areas are getting. So we want to look at ponds to have good species records from previous years to make sure that this can be quite a bit of a robust study. But we also want to look at the difference between ponds that are maybe isolated, like the one in Home Hills, from any kind of streams, or ones that are maybe linked to other waterways, or some that might even be prone to flooding, to see how that maybe affects the pesticides in the water. And the main research question that I'm really looking at is what the impact of the dogs is on the vegetation structure, but also the water quality, and to see if there's a link of those things with species richness in the ponds. So when I'm going to go out sampling for the ponds, I'm going to do some netting to see what dragonflies we can find, but maybe also having a look at other species in the ponds, similar to the nitrate study, to see if there can be some kind of species score getting drawn up to link that with the vegetation structure, but also the pollution in the water. The other question is whether we can actually find those pesticides from the veterinary treatments in the ponds. That is by no means guaranteed that we can find them. Be interesting to see if we can find them at all, and if so, in which ponds, and also at what concentrations. The problem with these pesticides is that they can be deadly in quite low concentrations, and they've also been shown to have sublethal effects that can stop dragonflies from growing properly, from hunting. It changes their behavior. And that has to do with the way these are functioning. So these are neurotoxic chemicals, and they interfere with the way that the brain works. And once you've been exposed to those chemicals, apparently that can't be undone. So it could just have a lot of different impacts on dragonflies, even if it's not immediately deadly. But at such low concentrations, it could be actually quite a challenge to find them in the water. And then the other area that I want to look at, as I said before, is if there's a link with the distance of ponds to urban areas or popular pathways or dog walking rides, to see if that is maybe an indicator as well. So it's a combination of those kind of things. But as I said, we're still in the planning stages of this project. So if you have any thoughts or any other suggestions, none of this is 100% set in stone just yet. So I just wanted to thank the British Dragonfly Society for their ongoing support with the project. I've also had support from the Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. I'm currently doing my Great Crested Newt license, so that we chat with them about the project, and they were really keen to find out if the impact of dogs would also translate over to amphibians. And I've had a wee chat with a lady from Frog Life as well, because there's a couple of ponds in England where they've actually started to fence them in to exclude dogs from them. So I think it could be quite an interesting project for quite a few different nature conservation organisations to kind of look at these results. And in particular, I would like to thank Steve Brooks, who came up with this idea in the first place and still is providing ongoing support and advice for me, which is really great. And with that, I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions.